interesting that you asked the question, what kind of country do we want to be? So I think this is interesting because recently I think it's the National People's Power, that's Anukumar Desanayaka's coalition, the JVP-led coalition, they released their manifesto. The manifesto was a bit of a mix and match. I've written about it. Quite a few commentators have written about it. One of the things that the JVP and generally the leftist parties tend to do is sort of critique the global economy and the open economy. The NPP manifesto itself was quite confused, so I won't go into that too much. But where do you stand on this critique of free trade, neoliberalism, considering the Trump phenomena and how he sort of changed the conversation about free trade in a way, for better or for worse, considering Sri Lanka's dependency on exports and foreign markets? Is there any sense in Sri Lanka making this critique of neoliberalism and free trade?
Honestly, I don't think it's sensible because even though we always tell or we always say that we are a trade-oriented country, we are actually very protectionist.
Yes.
There are lots of import barriers and import taxes that pretty much keeps sort of the outside world at bay. And it allows a lot of domestic sort of companies, or like what we call in economics, rent-seeking behavior, where they make undue profits because of these protectionist structures. Right. And, a lot of people have written about it, people who know far more about this than I, and the need to get rid of these sort of make Sri Lanka more open. I mean, it's not even a question, and I definitely don't agree that we should be critiquing.
I mean, I suppose to play the devil's advocate, I think they'll say that the conversations are that if you end up allowing imports in, that you essentially, it's competition, you're introducing competition. And what's proven to be the case in Sri Lanka is that our labor laws and our labor culture, let's say, broadly, isn't competitive. Right, so then it comes back to your question about what kind of country do we want to be. It's not easy to fire an employee in Sri Lanka, good or bad, I don't know. It depends on your point of view. There's a social safety net, whether that's enough, whether it's not adequate, whether it's sustainable, aside it exists. In your view, on a personal view and as an economist, how do you view this trade-off? Because economics is about trade-offs, right? So how do you protect worker rights, worker protections, how do you enforce that kind of thing, versus competing with this global supply chain and the global market? How do we balance those two?
Yeah, so on the labor law issue, there is this understanding that our labor laws are quite restrictive, and that keeps a lot of sort of investors out because they don't have the flexibility to hire and fire. But I think there's a bigger issue, there's a larger issue than just the matter of our labor law. They are staying away for much bigger issues than just the labor, right?
Right, okay.
So we need to address sort of that entire gamut of issues rather than focusing on this one issue.
True.
And definitely, I mean, we don't need to box ourselves into, we are going to be an open economy, we are going to forget about workers' rights. There's always, like as you said, there's a trade-off, and there's always give and take, right? You give a little and you take a little, and there is definitely lots of room to protect worker rights. And the other thing I would like to say is, even though we think we have really strong labor laws, you do come across so many anecdotal cases where laborers are treated terribly and in really bad fashion. So, I mean...
That's a good point, because I think a lot of people assume that having strict labor laws is a protection against exploitation, but I think we've seen it with our own eyes, exploitation is rampant.
Like,
so that's a fair point.
Examples is these manpower companies, right?
Exactly.
So they'll always find loopholes, they'll always find workarounds, but really it comes down to, how do we balance everything? And definitely, like if you're talking about investments, it's not just one point that needs to be addressed. There's like a whole array of issues that we need to focus on.